As you can see, we interviewed 57, 38 took our executive assessment, and of those, about 23 were in the Fortune 500, 18 in the Fortune 1000, and then we had 16 women that were CEOs or are CEOs of major prominent private companies. And what we're going to be sharing with you is what we learned as a result of that endeavor. And what we'll share is in two areas. We'll share what we can learn for the future generations of women, many of you on this call, and hopefully many behind that. And then what we can learn about how organizations can take this information and put it to good use. As we're talking with you, you will gain insights from both Evelyn and myself. I led the project overall, and Evelyn led the research that we pulled together and that we'll be sharing with you. As we go through, you'll hear us talking interactively together, and so don't be surprised when we chime in together, and we'll also be mindful of questions that you might have as we go through. What we wanted to identify today were some of the highlights that really key in on things that we can do to change and make a difference for the future. There is a lot more in the report, and feel free to pull that up online at any time at your leisure. There's a ton that we will not cover this morning that I think you'll find very beneficial. But one of the things that we found that was really interesting is that there was a tremendous amount that was in common with the women that we interviewed. And Evelyn, I don't know if you want to just key in on a couple things relative to that as we dig into what it means to identify potential early.
Absolutely. We were surprised and a little bit shocked when we looked at the assessments of the 38 women who participated in our executive assessment, and we compared those women's traits to our CEO benchmark. And the CEO benchmark is based on the 99th percentile of performers and engaged CEOs in our database. When we looked at that comparison, we saw that the women in our study matched or exceeded the scores of those traits 17 out of 20 times. So the match was almost perfect. It was almost a mirror image of CEOs in the 99th percentile. So this was really illuminating. I think that made also it more interesting to look at the places where there was a little divergence. And we noted some differences specifically in the areas of confidence and humility. The women scored a little bit lower in confidence compared to our CEO benchmark and higher in humility. And this was interesting to us because I think we've all heard about the imposter syndrome. And we wanted to know, is this really an issue? And as we dug deeper, we realized this is not about the imposter syndrome. These women do not lack confidence in the slightest. It's the way that they exude confidence. And so for the women in our study, they were very likely to give credit to people and to propel them to success. They were less likely to take all the credit themselves. And that's a theme that I think we will expound upon later as well. I think the other thing that we saw that was interesting when we compared the women who are CEOs to women coming up through the ranks at other levels of professional leadership, we saw that we could really distinguish and differentiate the women who do become CEOs because they are 2 times more likely to score high on the 6 competencies you see on the screen. And so the sum of this for me, having been a leadership development and talent management leader in a major Fortune 500 company, is we have the clues that can be identified very early on in people's career. It's not a secret. And if we are able to identify these qualities and these skills early, we can invest in accelerating the development of those folks. And Jane, before I pass it back to you, the other thing I would mention, in addition to identifying talent, identifying potential early, to be transparent about that, and that's a little foreshadowing as well.
Right. And Jane, before you speak,
absolutely. And one of the things that's really important about this insight and why we feel somewhat revolutionary for organizations and for each of you as women leaders is that there was so much continuity across the women. In fact, I'll share a little insight. When the research was first presented to me and we saw the line for the best-in-class CEO profile, the women's line was so much in sync with it that I thought they'd forgotten to put it on. So what it says is that when women have these traits, and because there was so much continuity across all 57, it's a very good indicator of potential as well inside the organization. And one of the things that we know about people is that there is a certain set of capabilities that we have that is somewhat hardwired in us. And there are other things that with experiences and great potential we're able to build and develop on. In this case, what we're talking about are some of the things that are parts of the traits that are hardwired into these women. And so as we think about organizations and really getting the opportunity to widen the aperture, to make sure that women who have some of these traits and indicators are really getting the opportunity to be in experiences that are going to develop them and create a level of awareness inside the organization. And that leads us to some of the things we learned about career paths. So as we're talking about this, there's a level of continuity. But as we move to the next slide, we're going to be talking about what it looks like for women to follow different paths that are going to lead them down their experience path. And one of the things that we were shocked about was the need to illuminate that path to CEO in much more visible ways. Think about this. When we talked to these 57 women and asked them when they realized that they could be CEO, 65% of them actually were not aware or had thought about their own potential to be CEO until someone in their career path highlighted that for them. There were only 7% that had considered it and then said, I don't want to be a CEO, despite the fact that they ultimately, I'll use the word, got drafted into being a CEO. And then there were about 12% that actually had thought about it and were interested and engaged around building a career path that would take them to becoming CEO.
So Jane,
we thought that was so important. Yes, please.
Jane, sorry, I'm sorry, and we have a little bit of a delay here, and I don't mean to be rude, but I do have a couple of questions, and we do have some questions that are coming up from our guests. Again, to confirm, in the last slide, these are traits, so they're innate behavior, innate traits that we have. So is there any effort or opportunity in trying to identify these traits in girls, for instance, at a very young age? When is the age when we start to kind of monitor these things? And I would argue the earlier the better, correct?
Yes, one of the things that I think is so important as we think about future generations is that our daughters really understand what's possible much earlier in their lives. And, some of these traits involve things like loving challenge. They have to do with a level of resilience. They have to do with a huge motivation and sort of thinking in terms of gas in your fuel tank. Those are the kinds of things that you can notice at a very young age with our daughters and granddaughters, and really helping them to see very early that this is something that they might aspire to, and not necessarily for the title, but because they want to do great things and they want to have a great level of impact. And that's a little bit of leading into some of the other important insights that we've got around the women that become CEOs. But I think particularly as women start in their careers in the corporate world, understanding that some of those things that they know about themselves are going to enable them to be a good risk for top leadership roles is really critical. It's also really important for organizations to pay a lot more attention to some of those hardwiring areas earlier on, so that the thing that's been happening a lot in the past doesn't continue. And what that looks like is making sure that the right experiences open up for women to jump into P&L leadership and operating leadership in some of the guts of the business, as opposed to being more often moved into functional roles that have much less likelihood to position them to be able to be a CEO. Evelyn, I'm sure you'll have a couple comments to add on this as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. At Korn Ferry, we think about measuring who people are and also what they can do. And obviously the who you are is more ingrained and more formed by the time you reach your professional career. It was astounding how listening to the stories of these women in terms of their early formative experiences and the situations and family and parents that shaped them, their philosophy, their work ethic, their resilience. And I think the message we can send to young women and even girls is just, get to know yourself and don't be afraid to sort of spread your wings. There were a lot of stories of women who knew that they had natural inborn leadership traits and they weren't going to back down. They were going to find the right venue to be able to give back what they were able to do, if that makes sense.
Right. Evelyn, and I think this question would probably go to Jane, but when I see that number at 65%, someone else told them that they could be a CEO, it strikes me that mentors play a big role in women climbing the ladder at the C-suite. I know that Rosalind Brooks will talk about her own experiences later on in the program, but I wanted to ask that question about mentoring and how critically important it especially is for women when they think about being a CEO.
Yeah,
that takes us to our next slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. I hope I didn't steal your thunder there.
No, it was a great lead in. And, one of the things we're going to be talking about now is sponsorship, which is a little bit different than mentoring, but very much interrelated. But, one of the things that I would highlight, and this is for all of us who have children on the call, is in many ways the first sponsors for the women that we interviewed were a mother or a dad who really told them and in many ways communicated to them that they could do whatever they set their mind to do. And so, in a sense, I'd like to challenge all of us on the call to be sponsors for future women that are CEOs with our own children and with the children of others that we see as having talent. But what we're talking about here is going to be more geared to the corporate side of things. And what we found was that the people who had the conversations with the women that were so powerful around what was possible and opening their mind's eye to becoming a CEO were sponsors. And what we talk about with sponsorship is someone who is in a position of power already, someone who is able to create a light on someone's capabilities and to pull them into opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily have on their own. What we know from the research is that that is not happening at an early enough stage because what we found was that women were on average 4 years older when they were tapped to become a CEO, and they had a few more job experiences to be viewed as safe to put in that position. There were generally about 1.5 roles additional if we were to compare the men who are CEOs to the females in this study. Why is that important? It's important because what it tells us is that if women were more conscious to the things that are possible for them and were engaged in conversations and visibility earlier on, then we'd probably have a much more robust pipeline. One of the things that we joked about as we were looking at the research output was that in the case of women, the results were almost always assured. They were outperformers in almost every category. But the packaging wasn't always as much of a priority. And there was a mindset in the women that said, you know, if I do the right things, then I will end up getting promoted. And that is not necessarily the way the world works. You know, there's the saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know. We'd like to suggest that it's not only what you know and who you know, but who knows what you know. And that's what we're talking about when we are speaking relative to sponsorship.
So Jane,
Evelyn, anything you want to add on that?
If I could, this is Mike again, sorry. And
Absolutely.
We have this delay, so forgive me. But I do want to be responsive to some of the questions being asked. And one of the questions, it's a good one. It's like, during the study of these 57 CEOs, did any of them take a substantial period of time to have children, raise children, a year plus? Or did that come up in any of the interviews?
Yes, well, as a matter of fact, what you would find is that these women were very normal in most regards. They have children, they deal with a lot of the same juggles that we all do. And what they were able to do was they early on made some important prioritization decisions, and they set themselves up to have the support they needed to focus on the impact they could have in the workplace. But they were moms, and they were dedicated moms, and most of them had made a very important career choice in terms of their partners. And they were people that were some of their strongest fans and sponsors.
Well, you know, and in addition to that, another question has come, you know, this is always a challenge, but question about, you know, how does a young woman who might be in that leadership position, how does she assert those skills, those innate skills that we just talked about, without being labeled as bossy, rude, or ignorant? How do you strike that balance?
I think
that's interesting, Mike. Oh, go ahead, Jane.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's an art form. And Evelyn, go ahead.
Well, we had a few examples. I think we've all, you know, for those of us who are women, we have had different experiences in the workplace where we've had to be very nuanced about asserting our opinions, our expertise, our credibility, while also taking care to, you know, make sure that everyone around us feels their value. And I think that in some of the interviews that we conducted, we saw evidence of just how masterful these women were able to balance those things. You know, one woman, knowing that she was, you know, one of the only women partners at a firm, was especially conscious of the fact that she was never going to be part of the in-group, which was predominantly male. But she set out to be one of the people who was in with the in-group, right? So one of the favorite go-to people who was always delivering incredible results and very optimistic. So I think a lot of the outlook and philosophy and qualities we see in these women were that they were incredibly resilient, incredibly optimistic, you know, very headstrong, and if they needed to leave a company in order to fulfill their potential, they would. In fact, a lot of them left temporarily to go start up firms on their own. An incredibly common trait that these women had. They wouldn't compromise who they were, and they wouldn't make themselves smaller, but they would occupy their space with a graciousness. And if that was not welcome, they would go find a place where they could make an impact.
The other
Great.
thing that I would comment on that I think is really important is it's much easier to be highlighted by someone else than to highlight yourself. And this is where the role of sponsors, just coming back to kind of where we started, is so critical. In the case of these women, they were highlighted by people around them, not always, and many of them ran up against significant headwinds. But what they tended to do is to reshape that into the form of opportunity. And they were so focused on the goal that the goal actually is what was really more highlighted than their own visibility. And that's probably another good point for all of us as we think about gaining visibility on behalf of something that's worth doing, which may lead us nicely into the next slide. And that is that there was a huge focus on the part of each of the women that we talked to around making a difference in the world and wanting to achieve things that were worth doing. They had this, as you heard from Evelyn, kind of a challenge junkie orientation to life. And we actually joked that the women were much like water. You know, rocks aren't an issue for water. Water figures out a way to go around and over the rocks and actually creates something of beauty in doing that. And that was very much the case for the women. And the reason that they were so resilient was because they were so motivated and driven around a sense of purpose. And one of the things that's so important about that learning is that we often, in terms of the corporate hierarchy, articulate things in a very competitive, label-focused way that is simply not inspiring to the types of women that became CEOs in this study. And what we wanted to highlight for you today is how important that is, both in terms of understanding yourself, if you're a woman who's on the rise in a career path that could lead to CEO, or if you are inside an organization and looking at attracting high potential women who are likely to have the impact that you want or need. The way that we articulate that in the job market is really important, because if it's articulated around what can be accomplished, how communities, the culture of an organization, the individuals who are employees in the organization can be enhanced and moved forward, that is much more likely to attract a woman and be the counterbalance to some of the issues and challenges that have to be faced. We also found that it was very interesting that a number of them articulated as their top career achievements developing a culture that enhanced the opportunities for the people inside the organization to achieve and to feel fulfilled and to contribute from their perspective.
Interesting.
Any questions you had on that, Mike or Evelyn?
No, you can keep going. I'm getting questions along the way here, but some of them might apply a little bit more to Roz Brooks, so we'll pull them off.
Evelyn, do you want to comment on that before we jump into the next slide?
No, I think it builds perfectly into the next slide in terms of what you're describing. So keep going.
Well, actually, Jane and Evelyn, there was a question about the 23%. Actually, these numbers in general, how do they compare with? Or I know that wasn't done in this particular study, but do you know how that would compare with similar studies for men?
Evelyn, do you want to take
Mike,
that?
Sure. We worked really hard to keep the scope and focus of our research project. As you can see, it was really an enormous undertaking. And so the purpose of this study was not to compare women to men as much as it was to understand the qualities and commonalities that these women had that can instruct us to help accelerate the path for women to reach the top leadership role. I'm not as familiar, frankly, with studies on male CEOs and their sense of purpose. However, I have conducted research on some of our Korn Ferry acceleration programs for CEOs and executives. And I do know that in general, when people get in touch or are able to articulate a core purpose of why it's important for them to achieve, why it's important for them to excel in a certain area, this was larger than themselves. And that enables a couple of things. One, it enables them to take risks and disassociate failure with from their ego. So they're more likely to say yes to big if they know that they are doing it for a reason more than just status and power and their own glory. They're very much focused on what they can contribute and the difference that they can make. And in that sense, the only thing that's at risk if they don't take the job or if they fail is that difference in the world doesn't get made. And so it's a way for not just women, but everyone to lean into risky things that are a little bit scary.
I think that's a great response, Evelyn, and it actually is a great lead-in to the next area that we wanted to cover, which is beware the glass cliff. Many of you have heard the story of the glass cliff, where women are put into positions that are so difficult and have so many challenges that it is very hard to succeed. And it got coined the glass cliff, probably in sync with the glass ceiling. One of the things that we observed around the women in the study is that they scored so high on challenge as a key driver and were willing to take risks. And that is a good thing in general. What's important, though, is that women are able to think about the longer-term trajectory that they have ahead of them, and that organizations don't take advantage of that willingness to take on these challenges in situations where it's almost impossible to win. And that's one of the things we wanted to highlight on the call today, because it's important as we move forward in our careers that we have people that are willing to take on key challenges, but then it's also important, and maybe even more important, that we set those folks up to not fall off a cliff that they're unable to recover from. And this is a really important learning for individuals, but also for organizations. Because one of the things that is the most important to leadership development is having the opportunity to learn and to grow, and sometimes you do fail. And having people that are able to take it as far as it can go, and if it's not a home run, still have a place to come back to and to build on, given that they're high potential leaders, is really important. Evelyn, I know you have more to share on this.
Yes, I think the thing that's unique about women taking on these kinds of risky, high likelihood of failure situations is that when and if they do fail, it's more likely for the failure to be conflated and associated with them personally than it is for a man. And so that we need to be careful not to stereotype or typecast people according to a situation that was probably a no-win or a very, slim possibility of success. So I agree. We need people to take these types of roles. There's probably going to be an increase in these types of roles in companies in the future, just by the nature of our world and our business. And so while we want to really honor the women for their incredible motivation of being motivated by challenge, their incredible trait around being willing to take risks, we don't want to punish them for being incredible trailblazers and pioneers. We want to support them. So that would be the kind of the lesson there.
Let me ask a question that's a little off topic, but it's kind of come across the screen. Do you have a sense as to these 57 women? Did they largely come from a supportive corporate culture with women in leadership positions, or when you mentioned the term trailblazers, did they really have to kind of come in and break some china to get to where they needed to get to? Any sense as to that?
Sure. It was really a mix. And what was encouraging, as a matter of fact, is that some of the more recent appointments to CEO in the Fortune 500 had actually been mentored by some of the women who were also CEOs. And so there was definitely a generational impact that we saw there. There is a need for courage and a delivery that is probably stronger to overcome that break the China orientation that you talked about, Mike. What we found is that there was a nice balance in these women, and it spoke to having results that were pretty quantifiable. And one of the things that we also noted that we haven't covered, but that I'll just mention, is that most of them were in situations where they were able to define a level of credibility and some really strong outcomes earlier on in their career, and that gave a bit of trade-off so that when they went through some of these tougher scenarios and were viewed as being tough and willing to take the hard line, that it went along with positive outcomes as opposed to just being difficult by personality. Most of them, however, were pretty humble people, and I think there's a great note of acknowledgement of the people around them as we are approaching Thanksgiving. Nice to say a level of real appreciation for the people around them, and particularly of the team nature of accomplishing great results.